Welcome everybody. I'm Associate Professor Harsh Suri and I lead the Business Education SIG. And we've got today with us Brent Gregory, and I'm delighted to have him as a speaker. This is part of a series of webinars for Business Education SIG. So as compared to other SIGs, our SIG is the newest SIG. We started this year and then COVID-19 happened. So understandably, we've been a little bit slow in picking up kind of activities, but we hope we can rev it up. And we've got a business education stream at this year's ASCILITE conference. We've also got with us today Sandra Barker, who's also on the steering committee, and Brent is also on the steering committee. Brent is a chartered accountant whose pre-academic professional career focused on helping business owners improve their returns. And he brought all those skills and he applied them to his students' learning journey. And so it's always he's thinking about what's the return that they are getting for their investment in terms of the time that they're spending. And he refers to it as scalable personalization, which is fantastic because we often talk about personalization and we think not scalable, not sustainable. But it's really impressive the way Brent has taken kind of personalization in a very, very sustainable format. And his progress in this has been recognized with a number of awards. So this project contributed to him getting a faculty award at University of New England, Educator of the Year Award, ASCILITE Innovation and Excellence Award, and also the much coveted AAUT Teaching Citation Award. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brent, but may I also request you to turn off your mics? And if you have any questions, please post them in the chat section. Over to you, Brent.
Thank you very much, Harsh, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk about something that clearly really interests me and to see what other people I can find that may be interested in this, because I see the future in this area is very much about collaboration, and that's probably where I'll start, and I'll probably get back to that in the end. But really, before I embark on the on-demand exams journey, I would like to stepping outside education. So a bit over a week ago, I lined at the start of the Armidale Trail Run, the Javal Dam Buster. I'm not quite as fit as I should be, because this involves a climb of about 4 kilometres, and then it starts to get really steep for another 2 kilometres, and about 70 minutes into the run, the first person was finished the run. But here's a picture of me at that 70-minute mark, and I'm still heading up the hill. So about an hour later, I'd finished, and from that, and you can see where I finished at about position 116. People gradually finished from the first finisher at 70 minutes up to my time fairly consistently, and then we can see people continue to finish up until the cut-off time of 3 hours. Now, we're probably not surprised that people take different amount of time to run a 15K trail run in very hilly country. After all, we each come with different skills, levels of fitness, motivation, health, background. People are different, and so they're likely to take a different amount of time to complete a similar task. It's due to these differences that many students are able to perform better in the environment that is built around online assessment and online exams. So conceivably, you're here today because you'd like to think a bit if on-demand assessment has some beneficial role for you. And over the next 30 or so minutes, maybe a little bit more, I will attempt to provide you some insight into why I believe on-demand assessment is valuable, the path that led me to this decision, what do on-demand exams involve, and what does the on-demand exam environment look like? And then I'll finish off with some discussion about probably more the nuts and bolts, some things you really need to know. So firstly, a bit of context about this decision and the why. When I started my academic career, I was delusional about my students. I had an image of a professional, motivated, focused group of students whose prime goal in life was to succeed in my unit. But I did come to the realisation that my actual students were a far less polished product. I was about their living circumstances, their skills, their motivation, their working life, their responsibilities, their abilities, their disabilities, and especially about how to gain share of mind. And that's what we really need to work from, because as academics, we are competing for student headspace. In my case, it's about how to get students to fit introductory accounting into lives that are already packed and potentially full of distractions. So right up front, I will share with you 4 key learnings that were helpful for me. And a little later, I'll provide some context and I'll share with you 5, 6, maybe 7 by the time I get there, things you should know about on-demand exams and making them work for you. In fact, those 5 or 6 or 7 things, depending on how we unpack them, are relevant to all online exams, not just on-demand exams. And they're crucial to know before you do embark on the on-demand exam journey. So let's think about, there's 4 key takeaways for you, I guess, to get right now, and then we'll drill down more into the details and how I got to these things. So number 1, and this took me a while to come to, but choice interrupts action. So be cautious as where you provide flexibility. Flexibility is important, but make sure it doesn't act as a distraction. For many of our students, deadlines are essential. This is important to push hard with students, but we then need to provide mechanisms if they don't meet the deadlines. I've found with my students, and it could be likely even with other students, we have a golden period. And that's when students are far more likely to engage in the content we have. So sure you make the most of that golden period. Don't fill it up with stuff that is not crucial, which was one of the early mistakes I made. Now, the really obvious golden periods are when students first start and when they're leading up to the exams, and probably also leading up to other assessment paths. And the 4th key takeaway is make sure you develop great pathways for students that signpost them to their next crucial action. If you want to help them get through more quickly, that will make a big difference. So now let's step back and to think we're talking about getting share of mind, because that's such a crucial task for us as academics. And as we work through the next few slides, I'd like you to consider how what I'm talking about now matches up with your own personal experience. As I've already suggested, student share of mind is so crucial for us. And the delusional me that I've talked about before thought about things like this. You wanted students to learn a particular thing or develop a particular skill, and you knew they would learn this if they undertook a particular activity. So all you've got to do is set the right activity and student learning will result. That's a pretty defendable assumption. However, and this is the big however, the path between the activity we set and the students taking the action, unfortunately, is not that blue arrow down the middle. Because as humans, we can only process a minuscule proportion of the information that surrounds us. So we have a number of inbuilt filters that delete, distort, and generalize our outside world so that we can sufficiently simplify that information so that we can internally represent it, the outside world inside our heads. Now, this is complicated because our students are surrounded by noise competing for their headspace. And some of this noise is simple, everyday stuff like what's for dinner, what activities do the kids have on tomorrow, What are people saying about me on social media? What are the football results last night? So as academics, we will benefit from investing in understanding our students so that we can help them to overcome the distractions that are before them. Now, what I've found that has been helpful is what I now call the help model. And the help model, again, is something just to direct your thinking, because it's built around 4 questions that need to be addressed when you set an activity. And the help identifies ways in which the message you are sending out can navigate the inbuilt filters that we all possess. So these 4 questions, and the H: what will hinder the student from starting an activity? For example, the instructions are not sufficiently clear. Secondly, what will encourage a student to start the activity? And that could be a student receives some type of message to remind them to start the activity. The L is what will cause leakage from progress on the activity. And mainly, this is to do with outside responsibilities or absorbing student time. And the P is what will promote progress on the activity. Now, promoting progress is where on-demand exams really come into play. So let me now invest more time in this. So, one idea that I found particularly helpful was Csikszentmihalyi's 1991 state of flow. Now, state of flow is the state in which people exhibit the highest state of intrinsic motivation, and he identified a set of characteristics that needed to be present for a student to, well, for any person really, to reach this state of flow. And this included having a challenging but achievable tasks that was defined by clear goals and supported by frequent, immediate feedback to confirm that confirm the progress towards the goal. Having the ability to concentrate on the task, and having the paradox of control. It's the paradox of control that to some extent on-demand exams play a major role. Being able to exert control on when a student can take their final exam provides many students with a much greater sense of control. And this is especially true when we build an environment with some of the other elements of flow. Clear goals, feedback, and they're the ones I just work on today. You are giving students the opportunity to become more engaged in the learning process. I'm about to put up 2 quotes from students that have worked through this model, just to get some sense of what we're working towards. Now, these quotes are not representative of all students, and we know this because we still have a really high failure rate in at least one of the units that I'm working with. But this is what we aspire to achieve, and this is what we're making progress towards achieving, and generally we're getting there bit by bit. We're clearly getting to this state by increasing numbers. The first quote is from the Moodle of the end of last trimester, and this student said, well, pretty much go through it. Despite this being a lot of hard work, and it is the unit that this is referring to as a calculation type unit. It's got a really broad cross section of students. Over the last few years, up to 50 different awards have put students through this, so there's a big variety of students, and it's accredited by a number of different bodies, so we've got to meet all that accreditation. So we acknowledge it's hard work, but the students said they enjoyed the challenge, and now I realise that I don't really want it to be over. So that's one thing we're aspiring for. Another one, and I guess this is an old quote, this is trimester 3, 2018. I put it up because this is from the first student that completed the exam in this unit, in that trimester. We have 11-week trimesters with 2-week breaks, so we call it 13-week trimesters, and then we have the exam period. This student completed the exam and got a HD in week 5, so they're not the average student. But he was disappointed when it was over, and if he'd been able to jump into the next accounting unit straight away, he would have kept going. Now, I will touch very briefly on the things that go into the decision to build this the way we did. And so, you know, to now for me to think about how I got there, the short answer is that I had almost a decade of introducing interventions that had positive results, but was way short of my expectations. I introduced a major intervention in 2013, and prior to that, the failure rate in this group was more than 40%. So 40% of students that were still enrolled at census date didn't pass the unit. Then I've got 26% pass, so simplistically, pass as a pass and a credit, and excelled is a credit and a distinction. There's so many just ways we can pack all the data in this, but I try to pick a pretty simple way that would summarise the data. So after operating the intervention for a number of years, the retention rate certainly improved, but it still sucked. We got failures down to probably, well, they're not failures, these are students that don't pass, so they can still withdraw late, they can just not sit the exam. There's a whole host of things that could not happen, but 35% of students were not passing. So at this stage, we're talking about 3 years ago, well, nearly 4 years ago now, I took a step back and decided on the holistic approach. And as Harsh said in introduction, I spent my career effectively as helping people improve their business performance. So I took some advice that I often give my students when they come to a challenging area, is to retreat to what you know best. And what I know best is improving the return for business owners. So I tried to apply that same process to helping my students get a better return. And I did that by firstly adapting a business framework that I'd used thousands of times to help businesses improve their performance. And I've come up with something, adapted it to put it in towards the higher education model. And this is called the RENT framework. And this is a structure to provide a solution. It's also important because I wanted to develop a solution that was scalable. Not just that gave students a better experience, that's scalable. I could deliver it for 100 students, 1,000 students, or 10,000 students for very little extra cost. So in accounting terms, it does have a higher fixed cost, but a very low marginal cost. So RENT is an acronym for 4 key areas that we need to pay attention to. So the R stands for record, and there are 2 categories of recording, compliance and decision making. Compliance is the records we're all obliged to keep, for example, marks. Decision making records help us improve the quality of the product. I'll give some examples of the decision making records as we go through, but I won't deal with it in too much detail. N deals with the needs, and this is particularly about student needs and society of needs. I've already discussed that a little bit when I talked about the student need for how we need to package things. T is for team, and I won't discuss team at all, except to say 3 quick things. The importance of virtual team members, clusters of competence. Get yourself in a group of people that are thinking about improving, because I've clearly noticed good things happen when motivated people get together. And 3, I'd say have an accountant in your virtual team. Every business has access to accounting skills, and an accountant will help you build a solution that is scalable. So it was through looking at this using the rent framework that I was able to come up with a holistic solution. And where I will invest the majority of my time talking about this framework is in the E, the environment. And in this case, the environment we're talking about is the learning environment. So again, it's probably time, having a bit of change of direction, to sit back and again think about your own experience with this. Think about your own in learning environment that you're creating. So on-demand exams with a progression pipeline is the learning environment that I wish to develop. Now let's drill down into that environment a little bit more. So point number one, big point, if you want to highlight things and write things down, another one of the takeaways, but I could have put it up with choice interrupts action. On-demand assessment is integrated in your learning environment. It's not an add-on. Assessment, I guess you know that, but it's so crucial to have that as part of your thinking all the way. Assessment has a crucial role in how you support your students to learn. So a part of that is to have a look at this map, because this is one part of the learning environment for introductory accounting. And it provides a visual representation of our approach, because we pay particular attention to developing well-signed posted pathways through scaffolded activities. So we can see here, we start, this is the introductory model, the first model, we start with the accounting equation, we go down the path through the basic and the expanded, and then we move on to accounting elements. Then we take a path through looking at in more detail of accounting elements, so the normal balance, through understanding debits and credits, understanding a bit about the history, because that becomes significant for some students, understanding why debits and credits work the way they do. Then back through a gateway, or in this case a bridge, to test that students have all the skills necessary, but then they go into accounting elements and the relationship to the financial statements. So we work through that path all the way around, the trial balance, the financial statements, the different type of accounts, then closing entries. Then another pathway to see they've got that, and we're ready to go on to the accounting cycle. Well, a bit about more at the start of the accounting cycle, writing journeys, what is needed, etc. And then there's a big pathway or bridge before they can graduate through to the accounting cycle, which is the next topic, the next island. Now you also notice over here there's a resource bank, which anywhere in this process they could be directed to go and visit, because they're resources they need to get a particular skill. So some of the key elements here is a clear pathway. We have gateways, or I've got some bridges as substitute for gateways, just to make sure that students have the necessary skills before they're permitted to move on. So that was just a visual representation of one module. Now here is the assessment flow of the whole unit, and this is what we build the unit around effectively. So this diagram, the assessment flow, provides the opportunity for me to answer some questions that I most commonly get asked about on-demand assessment. So let's look at a few things here. I'll direct you to the first block, the fundamentals. So in the fundamentals, you'll notice that we finish off with AQ1 in the blue. That's Accessible Quiz 1. That's worth 10 marks, and that's a summative assessment task. Before students can do that, they've got a gateway task, and that's the Gateway 1. And prior to getting into that, they've got to do the 2 tutorial quizzes, and they need to get, well, in this case, they've got to get a HD in this tutorial quiz for topic 2 to open, then a distinction for the gateway task to open. So we need such a high level of skills here. This foundation material is what everything else is built on, and if students don't get that, they don't pass. Now, why do we make that threshold so high. That's part of, I talk the importance of record keeping. We've looked at student results in exams over a decade effectively now. We've found area where they had blockages. We'll find if there's areas if students don't get right, they don't pass. And effectively what we've done is package a lot of that stuff together and put it in topic 1. So we know students just need mastery over that topic. I'll talk about a few other things. The gateway activities are all formative tasks, and they've got 2 major roles. One, they're a major source of feedback to students. Because the assessable quizzes are totally summative, we can't give any feedback, and we need to give feedback on all assessment tasks, both to comply with our policies, but also it's valuable for students. And that feedback comes in the gateway tasks. All of the marking of these is automated. There's no variation in the gateway task. It's very unlikely that any 2 students will get the same assessable quiz 1. They're all got the same learning objective, the same structure, but they should have different combinations of questions. And gateway tasks also stop students from progressing if they're not ready to move on. Students that move on when they're not ready are not likely to succeed. So we need to say, go back, get these skills, and keep moving on. So the progression pipeline enables a few other things. It enables us, so we also, this is a map of the assessment flows, and we also summarise that in what we call the progression pipeline, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go on, so you can see that. So here's a quick summary. A progression pipeline summarises where every one of our students is up to on any particular day, and these are just some example reports that come out of it. And some things I'd like to highlight just now, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail week by week so you can see this again. It's clearly, just like in the Javal Dam Buster Trail Run, not everyone moves at the same pace. And if you have everyone moving at the same pace, less people will get to the end. What I'm going to do next is show you the graphs taken from the progression pipeline at the end of each week. Now this will give us some sense of the varying paces that students work through, and I'll also highlight a few things on the way through, and it might be an opportunity for you to think about a few questions you have. So here's week 1. Now I'll talk about some things in the progression pipeline. Not RTS. RTS is the ready to start task. Now, it's something students should do on the first day. And the ready to start task is a short quiz based on the unit information and assessment overview. You know, the unit information and assessment is a thing that we tell those students to read and they never read. And then they asked us all these questions about the materials in the unit information or assessment overview. So we've set up a ready to start task that they must complete before they can move on. And it'll have questions in there like, on what date is assessable quiz 1 due? Now, until they get 100% in that, they can pretty much not open anything else. The topics won't. There's some other material open for them, but the topics won't open for them. They get 3 goes to do that. If they don't get it in 3 goes, then they've got to email us. And we can open up again, but we drew it. So we can see by the end of week 1, there's 87 students that have still not completed that. We get to week 2. This is the end of week 2, and the end of week 2 for us, our learning management system Moodle, is opened a week before it starts. So we're effectively 3 weeks into the unit, but we still sometimes have students enrolling in week 2. So that's the, after the material's been there for 3 weeks. So you can see why there's a bit of spread out already. So not ready to start, 48 already. There's a whole host of students have done the ready to start. When we get up and we see assessable quiz 1, there's already 30 students done Accessible Quiz 1, and there's, I think, 48 in all have gone, well, 18 gone past it, 30 is still at that level. So these students are well ahead. We get to 3, you can see, we go back, we can see some of it now. Students are starting to move. Of course, they said, righto, you should have Accessible Quiz 3 done. And there'd be some automatic triggers on Moodle now to send out to them coming this week. You haven't finished Accessible Quiz 1, so what's the go? Accessible Quiz 4, you can see there's 9 students have still not done the ready to start task, but 70 students now have completed Accessible Quiz 1, and so they're probably marginally behind, but you can see more than 50% of students are on track or ahead. Week 5, still 7 students not started, but you can see now that about 27% of students up around here, have completed Accessible Quiz 2 and beyond. So, well, they're starting to stretch out a bit. Week 6, you can just see how week 7, I've put it in red because this is a mid-trimester break. Week 8, mid-trimester break. I move through now towards the end. We're now getting towards the end, week 11. We can see the bottom 11% of the students now have little prospect of completing the unit. There might be a student or two here that does get a special extension of time, something exceptional, and they get through. There's another 20% of students where passing is conceivable, but will need a big effort. But many of these students from here on, you're looking like they've got a chance at least to finish the unit. Week 12, getting close to the end. Week 13, we can see now, the deadline is starting to loom, starting to get their act together. And if I move up until Sunday, and there hasn't been a lot of moves since Sunday, we can see now 156 students have completed Accessible Quiz 4, so that now permits them to do what we call the optional online exam. Well, if they pass it, Accessible Quiz 4. So the urgency of that deadline's really kicked in for many of the students. You also see down here, and I haven't mentioned them before, some students have taken the advantage to get ahead. There's 33 students that have already completed the unit. But this is out of 204 enrolments. Out of this area here of 156, and we're probably creeping up now towards the 160, there's 40 students that did not pass Accessible Quiz 4. So if they don't pass Accessible Quiz 4, they're going to need an intervention in order to pass the exam on the balance of probability. 23 of that 40 have already contacted us, so we can work out that intervention plan for this. It's also, we see that here, there's 6 students that have applied, have active extensions for here, and 2 that have active extensions for Accessible Quiz 3. So anyone that has not completed Accessible Quiz 3 now would be in big trouble of completing the unit. Even Accessible Quiz 3 is in a spot of bother unless they've done a number of other things. This is the time when I guess there's a fair bit of frustration from students, and it's also a time when things are really starting to come together. So a few things that I guess we're into the what you need to know. If you're going to go down the on-demand assessment path, I guess I'll speak in accounting terms, there is a significant capital investment in terms of being set up for the very first time. But ultimately, it's going to be much cheaper to operate. And potentially, you could have a unit operating all year round. You're going to have, look, I'll go through these in overview, and then I'll break some of it further. You possibly have some compliance issues. And me, I talked about how I needed to, the reason we have gateway tasks, the first reason they come in is because of a policy of having feedback on every assessment task. Must invest significant time in planning. I recommend that you start out small, build expertise, get a sense of what's happening, and start soon. before you launch into the whole on-demand assessment process. Academic integrity, or in accounting terms, we call internal control, and I like to speak a bit about that because that's a pretty big deal in this area. On-demand assessment, this, I guess, this implies online, and that's what I'm talking about here. I probably should have said online, on-demand assessment. There's a tremendous amount of data which it creates, which has advantages, but also it's going to have a looming issue, which is the next one, and this is life generally as protecting the privacy of people. It is likely to have a market appeal for many of your students, and ultimately this is on-demand assessment is something that's really going to be taken up in a big way. Now we want to talk about who will take ownership of that, I guess. What do I mean by a significant capital investment? So exams, potentially exam is 5 to 10 times the size of a normal exam. And when I talk about planning, I'll just give you a bit of an idea of what that could be. And the size of this will probably grow. Probably have compliance issues. I've addressed that already, and I said, for example, feedback on assessment tasks. You're likely to need some level of technical skill, or you need technical skill in your team, or you need, I talked about the virtual team. At the moment, most of the software available to us is a bit clunky, so that's going to, I guess, go through some changing. And I see this as an advantage because we should do it anyway. It requires rethinking your learning environment. And that's clearly what happened to me. I had to rethink how I taught. And this is especially related to the pathways and the gateways, and also about developing your feedback and appropriate signposts. But ultimately, and this is talking about big numbers, it is much cheaper to operate. So once it's set up, you can provide a much better and a much more personalised service. Start small, start soon, pick a low stakes assessment task. Here's an example of some planning. This has come from, we plan every exam in a spreadsheet first. So before we get into the learning management system, we plan them. So here's one section, says a 100-mark exam. Here's one section worth 20 marks, and it's 4 questions of 5 marks each. So here's some of the details. Questions 28 to 31. Close as a type of question where we can put in journal entries, financial statements, practice sets. I can put the balance sheet, the income statement, the trial balance. So we've got some scope of the things we put. There's a choice, so they've got to do 4, but there's a choice of 8 areas it could draw from. So they'll get half of those. They actually don't get a choice. That's what the system draws on them. And in each of those choice of 4, there'll be a package of 5. So with BD stands for bad debts. So in the bad debt section, there'll be 5 bad debt questions. Now then, we would go through and set out what those 5 bad debt questions are. And this is an example of where planning become quite significant for us here. Of course, the historical rating was, with that question being used before, or the equivalent type question, that type of question, the average mark was 56. So that's our rating. So we can see here that we had, out of this package of 5, we had 3 questions, 56, 59, 63, that were roughly equivalent, and the other 2 were roughly equivalent. So these were quite easy, 2 of them. So, but clearly, these 5 couldn't go in the one package that the system would draw down on. So there's a quick overview of the planning process. Academic integrity, internal control. That's what we speak in accounting terms. So what's the starting for that? Well, firstly is to create the environment. So the big thing about creating the environment is to emphasize your goals and the benefits. So emphasize that the unit what we do is structured around giving students the core skills as quickly as possible, and then help students understand if they follow the process, they will get the results they need. And that one of the biggest tools we have for highlighting the value of accessible one of the biggest tools we have is to highlight the value of accessible quizzes as a diagnostic tool. So our line is that if you do poorly in an accessible quiz, we can help you develop a plan to get you back on track. If your quiz is not all your own work, you'll miss an opportunity to get corrective action, work out what your weaknesses are, and then fixing that up. As cheating will ultimately cost you marks and it will rob you of the chance of valuable skills. So that's what we talk about, the environment that we're trying to create. And then we have a supervised exam, which must be passed at the end. So no matter how you're doing all the other assessment tasks, if you don't pass the supervised exam, you won't pass the unit. And also we have a series of gateway tasks that students must pass, and it lets them know if they're ready to go on. So this is all stuff about creating the environment. Then we go through a risk assessment. So, you know, the typical risk assessment, what could go wrong? What are the consequences? So the obvious things you'd think about in mine, you think about the events that could go wrong. So students could not do their own work in an accessible quiz because they're not supervised. And in fact, that's what we talked about before. Part of the activities we'll talk about next. Or they could copy down their work and they could share it with others that do the test at a different time, because they also could be done at different times. So we need to put activities in place. So what can we do to stop those things going wrong? So being the exam unsupervised and copying, so everyone doesn't get the same exam. And it's what we talked about with the environment. We have, as an activity, students must do a supervised exam at the end if they don't pass that. As well, we have a number of built-in check questions. So a check question is what is similar to a question in another paper, but we sometimes find it doesn't happen so much anymore, but if a student puts an answer in for question 1.4 in their answer for question 1.3, we know they've copied off someone that did the paper for 1.4. So you can have some questions like that. Other activities would be statistical analysis. And then we've talked about the data that's produced, and you look through that data and you get some clues of if students have not done the right thing. And that probably also leads to data as the monitoring. You need to measure what happens, and you need to use that and investigate when you find anomalies. So I'll move getting towards, I guess, time now. Student privacy is some big issues, and this is, as I said, privacy is going to become a big issue for all of us, not just for exams, not just for on-demand exams, but some common things that students are now asking is, why am I videoed? Where's the data on me stored? How long is it stored for? How can I find out what it is? How secure is it? Who has permission to access it? Who else that doesn't have permission could possibly access it? What can I get to have it deleted? So we need to really work on many of those issues. Now, probably one thing is I talked about where I got to before I started, and then I'll go through and now look at, I talked about before we started, because this is an attempt to summarize in sort of one graph my journey over the last 10 years, and I've talked about the first bit of that. And this is based on students still enrolled at census date, and that's what you've already seen. When we got to the beginning of last year, and we made significant progress again, especially where we're probably making the progress is students that excel. If we can get students to stick at it, they get a pretty high level of skill. So now, We've still got a long way to go. I know a lot of what I need to do, but again, it takes time. And, do I want to make that capital investment when I may well not be the one getting the reward? I'll put one other thing in context to have a look at how we did trimester 1 this year, and because it's not as happy story. And I guess with COVID, so we look there and we see with COVID, we were back to nearly where we were at the start of this whole process, marginally better, but nearly back to where we were. So if we make some adjustments to those figures, and we can allow for one thing UNA did, and I guess a lot of others did, they allow students to withdraw without academic penalty and virtually without financial penalty up to almost the end of trimester. So if I then take those students that took advantage of that, this is what the non-passers become. And now that's still not as good as T1 last year, but it's starting to get there. And if I look at where we're heading in this trimester, we've probably got a chance. Well, we probably should beat this, but I don't think we'll take a remarkable turn of events to get a result as good as what we got in trimester 1 last year. So I guess now to finish, this is something that just come through not very long ago from a student that come to, I got a student grievance to answer, and then I thought, but it probably wasn't that bad as I got into it. And I was just saying, in this area of competition amongst unis, and I think we need to look from competition to a bit of collaboration, because the competition in our space is going to come, I think, from outside the university sector. In some of these areas, that's where we're going to be challenged. But I did like this, but I feel the self-paced style, and it's not the way I'd describe it, would suit most students far more than the current old-fashioned approach. And it'd be good to see more students adopting, more units adopting this approach. In the end, this is the thought that I think is significant. I'm clear that a large portion of people will adopt this approach, because ultimately it can be much cheaper and get a much better experience for the student, and can be done much cheaper. Now, a problem is in a community, in a university, who's going to do that? Because as the lecturers, we bear the cost, the capital cost, but we're not likely to get the full return. So this is more suited in a sense to business. So the corporations will make the big investment up front because they know they'll get the return later on. Now, I'm not sure that's ultimately in the best interest of society, and especially if those corporations are like Google or Apple, that are not based in Australia, that not probably have the social conscience that we have. So we need to think about who controls this space, and I think we need cooperation in whatever we do. We really need to build the community that's going to deliver this and other things, and so we need to build the ability for us to cooperate. Right? As probably here's a plug for the Business SIG. That's one of the things that the Business Special Interest Group for ASCILITE is working on, is how are we going to cooperate more? How are we going to share what we're doing? So thank you, and my thought is, I guess, is cooperation from here on.
Thank you so much, Brent, for a very engaging and inspiring session. And it's interesting, the point that you've raised, from business education, we are so far off from kind of setting up of that kind of collaborative network, which medical schools have done really well in, because medical schools across Australia are happy to share their banks of questions and it would be good if we can reach that stage. So I don't know if you've had, I mean, obviously you were presenting and we've had some really good discussion happening in the chat box. And as Peter beautifully put it, it's remarkable the way you are co-creating the learning journey with students, and it's the way you are personalizing learning journeys of each student. So a few questions were about the rent framework. Some colleagues asked if you've published somewhere and you would be willing to share it. People also liked your help framework. So if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yep.
Equity issues, how are they addressed? And about, do you use group work in your units? And if so, how does that impact, or if you're using it in different units? And there were also questions about what's the weighting of the supervised exam and how do you meet the accreditation requirements?
Right, there's a pig, so I'll start. Can you give me an example of the equity issues? I'll start with that question. Is someone, I just wonder what particularly equity issue is there?
So the equity issue, extra time scribes, etc. What were so in terms of students on access plans, how do you address that?
Oh yeah, so if they need extra time, we just give them extra time on those assessment tasks. So that's just, so on a quiz, say they've got a quiz, for instance, and they're entitled to 70 minutes instead of 60 minutes, you can go in using a user override and that particular student just gets the extra 10 minutes. So that's a pretty common thing for us, if that's what the equity issue question was. So I don't know if someone's there with that. Did whoever asked that, did that answer the equity question?
Yeah, I think we can actually open the forum for everyone to ask questions now.
Right out, yeah.
So if you want to raise hands or if anybody else wants to make any comments. Group work? Group work?
I don't have group work. I am introducing it into not a unit I talked about here, but at a postgrad level, and so what that will be, everything else will be the on-demand, but the group work part, which will be an assignment, will not be on demand. So it will still be subject to the timeline at the end. But the only way that particular activity can work is that it's not a prerequisite learning for later things. So it's got to be an activity that's addressed towards the end, not towards the beginning. So the group work bit can't be on demand, but it can work in the on-demand environment.
Could you please talk a little bit more about the invigilated exams? How do you?
Yep, these are invigilated exams. UNE uses ProctorU, and so. And that's why I talked about the issues about students being filmed or videoed. Most of our students to this stage up until this year, I didn't have any particular issues with students worried about the privacy issues because the online exams were totally voluntary. But this year when COVID come in and UNE's doing pretty much all exams online, at the moment. So some of those are not voluntary and students have privacy concerns. So we need to find a different way to deliver those. And they are, so they can't be, if students choose to have a non-ProctorU invigilated exam, they can't have an on-demand exam. They can do everything else on demand because it's theoretically treated as a paper exam, even though it's not paper. But then we have all students must do it at the same time. It's not supervised, so we do an interview afterwards, and it's set at a different level. But they're all fully proctored.
Okay, could you also tell a little bit about how much time did you have to invest? Was there a project set up? And so just in terms of logistics of it, if another colleague wants to go down this journey?
In some ways, that's hard to answer. Of course, it evolved. There was no extra time I got from this. It was all done within my normal teaching time, and it's probably something that evolved from the first thing I did was I talked about in 2013, I think it was, I introduced the instant feedback accounting practice set. So a practice set's a pretty commonly used thing for teaching accounting. Ours used to be paper. I set it up in Excel for a number of reasons, and it's got 1,000 data entry points. But after every entry a student makes, they're marked, their progress is updated, and on they go. And students reported how motivating that was to get the instant feedback, and how that really got them into almost being addictive, and they'd get in and get the work done really well. So then from that, we tried to say, well, how else can we incorporate this? So then you thought, how can we give instant feedback for other activities? So that was probably not until 2018 we got to that. So we made sure then all our quizzes were online, and then we had, but they were still not on demand. They were online, but not on demand. And so that meant we already had a lot of that stuff in place. The framework was in place, and then we just had to merely move to the on-demand model. And the on-demand, the complexity was just making the databases richer for all the assessment tasks. And I guess because we'd automated so much, we invested our marking time, we invested into developing quizzes and writing automatic feedback. So that's what we went. So that's probably, that hasn't been a very helpful answer to someone.
But that's a good segue to the next question, Brent, where someone said, can you please tell us more about your summative assessments? So for example, were they all knowledge-based MCQs?
Well, not multiple choice. We've got some multiple choice. Multiple choice, short answer, a really high proportion of them would be undertaking an accounting activity. So it might be writing journal entries, posting those journal entries to the general ledger or subsidiary ledger. Now, this probably doesn't mean much to, I guess, people that are not accountants, but then summarising the general ledger into the trial balance, producing the financial statements, work calculations, working through the process of calculation, depreciation or bad debts. We use very little multiple choice or matching, but we do use some.
So what impact does that have on marking time?
No, they're all automatically marked.
Okay.
So that can be all. So the major tool, if people want to, and I'm sure there's going to be better tools than this. Our biggest tool we would use in Moodle is called close questions, and that's spelled CLOZE. And basically, it's a series of boxes, and and you position your boxes together, and then you need to mark the boxes.
Thank you, Brent. Sandy, have I missed any questions in the chat box?
No, I think you've got them all.
Great. I think please join me in thanking Brent for an excellent session. So thank you so much, Brent. This was an excellent session. And before we all leave, I wanted to ask Sandy, perhaps if you could talk a little bit about our next webinar, which is on 3rd November. Sandy and Audria are going to present that. Sandy, may I hand it over to you?
Certainly. I'm just trying to find the screen that I can share. And so our next webinar is using simulations as a learning alternative, and I will be co-presenting with Audria Warner. And so we'll be looking at how simulations play a role in the student learning and what students have said they achieve through that process. So That will be, as I said, the 3rd of November at 10:30 Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time.
And we'll post further details. Thank you, Sandy. We'll post further details on the team's site. Thank you again, everyone, for joining in and for an excellent discussion. And thank you, Brent, for leading this session. I hope this does take us further and our community can join together to kind of do a bigger project. It's a pity OLT is not around, because it would have been an excellent project to take it further through OLT. Any last comments? Any last comments from anyone else?
I think the chat's all lots of thank yous.
Thank you. And I think well-deserved thank yous. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.